So the title of my presentation is Revisualizing Geographic Disparities, Examining Trends in Racial and Economic Inequality on Charlotte Streets without GIS. What is that? I'm not anti-GIS. We'll get into why. But for my project, the main point with computational thinking that I was looking at was assessing different approaches and solutions to a problem. And the reason for that is as we were going through this course, we got to use a lot of different tools, which is great. Some of them were more familiar with others. I found with my particular background that I was much more comfortable with tools like OpenRefine and things that resembled spreadsheets and databases. And I thought that that was probably going to be the case for a lot of people in the library world. And so I wanted to look at a way to use the tools and skills that people already had at smaller institutions to look at a different way to get at geographical data for people who maybe might not be as comfortable using GIS programs. So I wanted to take a look at racial and economic disparities over several of the most populous streets in Charlotte. And I wanted to do that using OpenRefine and Excel, and then creating some visual graphs using Tableau, which I thought were pretty accessible methods for anybody, regardless of their skill level or their comfort with GIS, just because we talked a little bit about GIS software. The ones that have the most user-friendly interface, like ArcGIS, are very expensive, and the open source ones like QGIS are great, but they require just a little bit more startup knowledge to use. And I thought Charlotte made an interesting geographic quandary because it has this kind of odd layout here where the axis, it's a grid, but the grid is not aligned with the north-south axis. It's based on the skewed axis of the intersections of Tryon and Trade Streets. So all the streets are either north or south, not according to the compass points, but whether or not they're north and south of Trade or east or west of Tryon. So it just adds a little bit of geographic complexity to the analysis. So my notebooks, the first notebook we're going to look at is my data manipulation steps. I wanted to keep it pretty simple and OpenRefine in Excel. So to find the most populous streets in Charlotte in 1911, I used faceting. I faceted the housing column in our master spreadsheet from the entire Charlotte directory. And then I sorted it by count to come up with the streets that had the most frequent listings in either the business or the residential portions of the directory. And doing that, I was able to determine that actually Tryon Street itself is the most common street that shows from the directory, kind of unsurprisingly. It's the main drag. But then there were several other streets that were highly represented in the listings as well. And so I chose 4 of those. I wanted to get a little bit further away from Tryon just to get a little bit more variety in who might be living there. So I chose 7th Street, Graham Street, 2nd Street, and Davidson Street to form kind of a grid around the axis to get a little bit more variety of data. And then using OpenRefine still, I added a secondary facet to the housing column so that I could facet by street direction. Because I was really interested in seeing a lot of times with cities and segregation, you notice a difference between whether someone lives north or south or east or west on a street. Even though in Charlotte, those are kind of at 45-degree angles rather than 90-degree angles. So I was able to facet through and select who lived on sample East 7th Street and extract just those 300 people from the 15,000 records. And then using transformations in OpenRefine, I added a new column called street direction. And just this kind of a very brute force method, I just copied the information from housing and then used a transform cells approach to replace, since we faceted down to just East Street, to replace that information with East. And it kind of ended up with some comical replacements here because I didn't tinker with it long enough to try to get it to just replace East once. I figured this was enough to know that you're definitely on the east side of the street. And then I exported the records for each street with the street direction into Excel and cleaned up the data there using.
So you're emphatically on East Street.
It's emphatically East Street. It's
Yes.
the eastest street ever. So I created a spreadsheet for each street that had east or west in a separate column. And then in Excel, I added another column for city quadrant, which I guess I could have done in Open Refine, but at that point I already had exported the Excel spreadsheets. And I just looked at the street map of Charlotte. This is the Tryon Trade Access. This is west, north, east, south. And I just looked at, okay, West 7th Street is actually in the northwest quadrant. And so I assigned each street half a quadrant in Excel and created its own column for that. And then I combined all those spreadsheets for each of the 4 streets I picked, the master spreadsheet. I'm not going to go through all my JSON operations. If anybody really wants to see all the data, it's there. And took that to Tableau to analyze the data. And I'm kind of running through my time, but so Tableau Publix is a free version of Tableau, so you can create and share sources. It auto-populates your fields for you, and so you can drag your different fields over to Tableau to create different graphs. I was trying to come up with a variety of different ways to visualize geographic distribution in the city. And you all know how to use Tableau at this point, so I won't belabor that. We'll just go straight to the actual findings. So rather unsurprisingly, for a segregated city in the South, when you do look into the patterns of data based on street direction and city quadrant, and then cross-reference that with the total population, the number of businesses, and race, there are some pretty stark patterns, which Sam's also, we saw in his data with the clustering in the city. And so I created a couple different ways to visualize this. So here, this is a dashboard for race by quadrant in the city, along with businesses by quadrant of the city by race. And I'm gonna, the dashboard's integrated here, but I'm gonna go ahead and click into Tableau just because it makes it a little bit bigger and easier to see. But you can see there's a pretty clear division going north to south throughout the city along that trade Tryon axis, where not only are the most populated areas of the city very majority white, they also have almost all the businesses. So Northwest, being the area that has the largest white population, has by far the most number of businesses and the fewest number of Black-owned businesses, whereas the two majority Black areas of the city have the fewest number of businesses, but the most Black-owned businesses. So not a particularly earth-shattering findings, but it is interesting to be able to look at the data that way without having to map all the individual addresses through GIS. And then as well, I looked at a couple streets separately, kind of paralleling what I saw as a division between basically north and south parts of the city. So 7th Street, which is up here on kind of that runs through the north side of the city, is almost entirely white. If we pop into this story here, it does still have about a 10% of the population is Black. But even though 10% of the population in that quadrant is Black, they only own 5% of the businesses. And they're almost completely segregated on the east side of 7th Street. So it's just kind of interesting to kind of play around with the data and be able to see some patterns. Again, the only Black-owned businesses, there are only 3 in that entire street, and they're all on the east side of the street. Guessing probably closer to the area where there were more Black residents. You kind of see exactly the opposite thing with 2nd Street, which runs through the southeast, southwest part of town, very majority African-American street. But still, even there, even though the white population only makes up about 25% of the total population, they own a third of the businesses, even on an African-American majority street. And again, you can kind of see there's a strong correlation between direction of the street and where people live, and the majority of the white people on 2nd Street live on the west side of the street. So yeah, so this was just kind of playing around the data, trying to make a project that would be accessible for people,